Okay, it is 7 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started here. And I wanted to just share with you quickly the things that we're doing here and how you can participate with us. So we have our YouTube channel and our Zoom meetings, our Patreon. We have our 17-week farmer career training program. We have our soil laboratory. We have consulting. And all of this information is at www.georgicrevolution.com, and you can go and you can see how we can help you to grow the very best food in the world. We're planning on doing a winter boot camp this year to teach people how to grow things in the greenhouse in the dead of winter. And so that'll be fun. Usually I do a spring boot camp where we can work outside in the outside garden, and we build a garden outside. But I really thought it would be beneficial if we did a winter boot camp this year. So we're going to plan that. We don't have a date set yet, but we're going to put that together, and I think that'll be a pretty great thing to be able to do. So that's one thing that's coming up. It is autumn right now, obviously, and so as the leaves are falling, we want to focus on having a place for our leaves. When leaves fall, we're supposed to leave them there. That's why they're called leaves. But it's tradition to take the leaves and rake them up, and then people do stuff with them. But now is the perfect opportunity to gather up leaves. A lot of people will just pick up leaves and they'll put them in trash bags on the side of the road, and the trash man comes and takes them away. If you know neighbors who are doing that, go get leaves and fill up your greenhouse, like the floor of your greenhouse. Put 2 feet of leaves in there. Turn on the sprinkler. Add a bunch of earthworms, and you're going to have the most wonderful functioning soil in the entire world. So that's some advice for this time of year in the fall. When you have leaves fall, leave them there. That's why they're called leaves. I got that quote from Brad Lancaster on his TED Talk. So that was pretty funny. Tonight's subject are 6 major things that we want to do to create a functioning soil, to grow nutrient-dense food. These are the 6 most important things. There are other things that I teach, but these 6 are the major things that I teach my 17-week students in the first month that they're here. So in the first 4 weeks that they come here and are on my farm growing and learning to garden, learning farming techniques, learning how to create a functioning soil, learning about pests and disease, and how to create the best food ever. This is what we focus on, are these 6 things. And I just briefly want to go over them tonight. I think it can be beneficial to just kind of have to kind of create a worldview, if you will. It's really not a worldview, but it's certainly a different way of thinking than mainstream agriculture. And I think next week I'll go over the things we talk about the second month, and then probably the next week what we talk about the third month. But I haven't even thought about that, but I think that's probably what I'll do the next couple of weeks. But these are the 6 major things for the first month that I'm teaching. So if a person only came for the first month, this is what they would learn. They could go home, they could have enough information to be able to understand the basics of creating a functioning soil and creating really good food. So if you look down at the bottom right here, I have the must know there. 4 things you must know. So we talk about the interactions, because we could, in one class, we go over this. The first day of class, when people get here, we go over this and we show them what to start learning and memorizing. And I have readings for them to do. They read stuff, and then we're talking about this while we're outside working all day and doing all the hands-on portion of the class. But we need to really understand the interactions. So if you just look at number 1, the 8 important organism groups, So each one of these interacts with each other, but everything on this slide interacts. So if you look at number 6, which is home for microbes, and the answer to that is the 5 spheres, okay? So we have the 5 spheres, which is what? Well, that's actually number 2 over there. And there's those different parts of the soil structure that create those 5 spheres. So let's just think, okay, let's create a home for microbes. Well, how does the 5 spheres, how does that interact, or what is the interaction to bacteria? And so we spend the entire first month talking about all of these interactions, and it becomes very complicated. And at the end of the first month, we have an oral examination, and the student stands up there in front of everybody else. It's very scary, except it's awesome because by the end of the first month, we're friends, and we've talked and joked about this and had fun, and so our class last year was fantastic. We didn't have people who were super nervous and worried about this. What we had were people who were really learning in the best way ever. I really try not to put people on the spot, although for those students of mine who are here, I know they're going to disagree and say they felt on the spot a lot, but we did it in a very friendly, good way, and they will attest to that. But the interactions is so important because we need to know why the agronosphere matters to the mineral cycle. We need to know why bacteria matters to context. So every one of these things on here, I just grilled my students about this until we knew and understood. And they would do the same to me. They would say, for instance, we're out there pulling weeds in the garden for a couple of hours on a certain section, and the entire time we often would talk about this stuff, and we would say, okay, what are we seeing in the soil here? How does it look? How is the mineral cycle working here? How do we know? Can you tell just by walking out in your garden and pulling weeds? Can you tell if the water cycle is working? And if it's not working, what interactions need to happen in the environment with those 8 important organism groups on number 1 to make that mineral cycle work? And so this was a good and a fun thing. If we go back to the must know on the bottom there to number 2, what creates each of these things? So there are certain management tools that humans can do that will create an environment for these things to thrive. So let's just go to number 3 here, where it says soil health principles. So what would make, or what can we do so that, let's look. So we're focusing on number 3, which is the soil health principles. But let's just think let's say our water cycle is not working. Let's say we get an inch of rain, and then 2 days later, the plants in the garden are dying and they need water after 2 days after having an inch of rain. That means your water cycle is not working. That means it was broken. Your soil did not soak up the water. And so what do we do? So we need to know what creates it, because on our number 3, those are the things that we do. I put that in red for my students. These are the things we do. So if we look at the major numbers on here, number 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6, we don't do any of those. We can't. If you look at number 1A, it's bacteria. You don't go out on your farm and bacteria. You can't do it. You can't go out there and bacteria. But if you go down to number 3, can you be mindful? Yes, you can. You can be extremely mindful. You can be present. You can be thinking. You can be focusing with laser focus with your mind and looking at the environment and observing and understanding what's happening. Mindfulness can certainly happen. Can you understand context? Now, an English teacher may say we can't context, but actually we do. So I'm going to break some English rules here, and we need to change that word, I guess, if you don't like it from an English perspective. But what I'm teaching here is that yes, you can walk out into your farm field or your greenhouse or your garden, wherever you're growing food, and you can certainly understand context. You can put things into context. You can manage your context. So, yes, you can context. There's a lot of contextual things you can do, and we need to be doing. And that's one of the things I try to focus on every day when I walk out there are the management practices that I am implementing today, meaning are the decisions I'm making today, are they within context of what I am trying to accomplish? So we absolutely context. So, and I mean, this is just an overview of this, so I'm not going to go through all of those. But let's go back to what we must know on number 3, the function of each of these things. So this is fun. And when we do our oral examinations in our 17-week class, at the end of our first month, our student stands up there and I just ask them, and we just go through this list. And I say, what is the function of bacteria? And they rattle it off. What is the function of fungus? They rattle it off. Protozoa, and they rattle it off. And so we go through this entire list, through all the 5 spheres, through the soil health principles, and the 4 ecological processes, and the function of infiltration, the function of the home for the microbes. So we go through this whole thing, and they get to a point, because we'll do this 8 or 9 times. When I say it's an oral examination, it's not a pass or fail examination. What it is, it's really an examination for me as a teacher to know if my students are going to be able to go home and to put this into practice on their own food producing venture, whether that's a garden, a greenhouse, a market garden. If they're going to run a CSA or a big farm, and all of these things are on this. The whole slide here can work if you have a 50,000 acre farm, or if you have a square foot garden in your backyard, or if you have an herb growing in a pot in your windowsill. I don't know if gardening gets any smaller than one plant growing in a pot. But from one plant growing in a pot to thousands, millions of acres, everything on here works. So that's why we focus on number 3, where 3B, where it says context, because we need to know our context, because we're going to be doing things a little bit differently when it comes to tools, when it comes to your, like, how much time you're spending each day. There are certainly things that you're going to be doing differently within context. But as far as growing the best food in the world, this is how you do it. It's right here on this slide. And there are some other things on the 2nd and 3rd month that we'll go over the next couple of weeks that that are, I mean, they're needed also. But if this is all you had, you can still do it. It just becomes easier. The clarification becomes more simple. The tools that are out there become defined on what we can use. Because a lot of times people see this and they're like, oh my goodness, this is, but I don't see how to do it. Or they're on the other side of the coin and they say, oh yeah, well, that's what I've been doing all along, when they're not. I say, well, are you tilling your ground? Oh, well, yeah, because that's how you farm. Well, what about no-till? And they're like, well, I do it all except for that. Okay, are you keeping your ground covered? What does that mean? It means that you have a very thick detritosphere. What's a detritosphere? And pretty soon we find out that their commercial way of farming is actually not what they think they are doing. But it's been interesting talking to people, because a lot of times people say, oh yeah, that's basically what we do too. But it's not what they do, because they are growing a monocrop. Their soil is covered for 5 to 6 months of the year. The rest of the time it's not growing plants. So their soil is not functioning properly. So it's interesting, because sometimes people don't even know what in the world I'm talking about. And so that's why we teach these classes, is to try to help people to create better food than what we now are having. And then when we go back down to the must know on number 4, defining a functioning soil. And what this means is equaling, it means that we grow without man-made inputs. Okay. And so I don't know, but this is a conversation we have. I hate the way that the number 4 is worded here. I'm totally admitting that, and I don't expect people to really understand it. But when we're in the class, we talk about this a lot, because the number one thing we need to do to create the best nutritious food, the most nutrient dense food, is to understand how to create a functioning soil. And when we do the things on this slide, it does create a functioning soil. And so, and what that means from a financial point of view, because there's a lot of ways of looking at this, but when you look at it from a financial point of view, if you can take away the man-made inputs that farmers purchase, you go from farms that are barely making it, or they're in the red at the end of the year, they're financially not making it, to farms that are extremely profitable. Let me just tell you, just most farms, like 99% of farms across the world, and I'm talking about modern farms who are, the way that it's been taught to do agriculture for the last, 100 years, basically, the way that the university, the corporate model, the USDA model of farming, their biggest inputs are fertilizer and fuel and labor. Those are the 3 huge inputs. And then machinery would probably be next. Now, here again, context matters, because it could be a little bit different depending on what you're growing. But for most farmers who are growing crops that get harvested and sold, it's fertilizer, fuel, labor, and those are your 3 big costs. So by doing farming the way that I am teaching here, and I haven't made any of this up. This all comes from just watching the way that the regenerative agriculture people are doing this, and there's millions of acres that have already proved that this works. So I'm just passing it on because more people need to hear about it. But the way that we want to focus on this is lower the costs of the fuel and the fertilizer and the labor. If we can lower those costs, it works out better. A lot of people hear me say lower the cost of labor, and they're like, well, does that mean you're hurting people in their jobs? Well, here is what has actually happened that I have seen, which is great as far as jobs and labor goes with agriculture. People doing the corporate model of agriculture, they hire a whole bunch of people to drive the tractors during the planting season, and then they lay them all off, and then they hire more people, and it's usually a different set of people during the harvest. So you got your planting season, they need 10 tractor drivers, and then in the harvest season, they need 10 drivers. And they're usually driving more like semi-trucks, not so much the tractors. And so that's kind of how the labor of modern ag has been for a long time. But now what we've done, instead of hiring 10 people, they'll hire 2 people, but they keep them on year round, and they can pay them more than they were paying the 10 before. So it's actually a much better thing for the community, because now a whole bunch of farmers have full-time people who can make a livelihood. They're getting paid enough. Instead of getting paid like minimum wage or prevailing wage, now they're getting a real salary, a living wage, where they can actually have a life and raise a family. So that's what's happening, and we can see that happening across the nation with people who are doing this. And here's why they've been able to do it: because they have taken the high cost of the fertilizer, and they've eliminated it over a course of about 5 years. It takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years to wean yourself off of man-made fertilizer. And the way you wean it off is it's right here on this chart. It's because bacteria and fungi are mineralizers. And so if they are very healthy and abundant in your soil, then they will mineralize the sand, silts, and clays into plant usable nutrients. And then the only argument beyond that is, well, how do you get nitrogen? Well, that's easy, because you keep the ground covered right there in number 3D. Keep your ground covered. And so by keeping your ground covered with plant material, it's decomposing, and then your bacteria and fungi will be eating that and driving the nitrogen cycle. And there's other ways to get the nitrogen in there too. By, have your rhizobium that's growing with legumes, and then you have azobacter and azospirillum. There may be others, microbes. Those are not on this chart. I'm just spewing off crazy words here, but those are the bacteria that create the nitrogen, to drive the nitrogen cycle. But there's a bunch of ways. The nitrogen cycle is really big and hairy. It's a whole class by itself. But once you do that, you create, see number 2 here where it says the 5 spheres, you create the 5 spheres, and that gives a home to number 1, which is the 8 important organisms. And once you've done that, by the way you do that is number 3. You do all of those on number 3, and then it fixes number 4 so the ecological processes are working. And now you have eliminated the whole problem of number 5, which is infiltration, because that's one reason our water cycle is broken. But now it becomes a big circle, because you can see that goes back into the detritus sphere, which is part of number 2. And then number 6, how do you create a home for microbes? You just build the 5 spheres. And now we've come full circle to the point where farmers are making money because they've eliminated their number 1 cost, which has been fertilizer for a long time. The number 2 cost is fuel. Instead of driving over the field anywhere from 5 to 10 times a year to put on all the applications of stuff and harvest, planting, usually they cover the acreage anywhere from 5 to 10 times, sometimes 12 times. You get it down to 2 times, because now you're going to have a planting pass as you drive your tractor across the field, and then you have a harvest pass. And when you're harvesting, you plant your cover crop seed during harvest. And sometimes you'll do 3 passes depending on context. You have to go back to context. But we've eliminated a lot of the fuel consumption, and you've eliminated the 4th big expense, which was equipment, because you don't need all that equipment anymore, because you've eliminated tilling. And so tillage takes the most horsepower. So now instead of 5 or 10 or 20 giant tractors, you can do the whole thing with 2 or 3 or 1, depending on the size of your farm, mid-sized tractor. And so you've eliminated all of these costs, and now you can hire, back to context, 1 or 2 people instead of 10 or 15 people to do the same amount of work. And those people are in a better situation, because instead of being migrant and transient and whatever type of workers they were before, now they're a member of your community, and they're earning a real living salary wage. So these are the 6 major things that we focus on in that first month, and we focus on those 4 things on the bottom that we need to know. The interactions between, I'll just do this the way I do to my kids or my students. I say, tell me the interaction between the mineral cycle and the porosphere. And they've got to spit something out. What I did is I had my daughter here this year, and my students would stand up, and I would ask the question. My daughter was running a stopwatch, and we got it down until my students could say the answer. They had 6 seconds to give me a complete answer, because I wanted a short, concise answer that makes sense. I didn't want people rambling on and then nobody knows what they're talking about. And we got it down to where all our students could do this really well, and it was awesome. 6 seconds for every answer. And we went to, I think we asked on this slide here, we asked anywhere from 75 to 85 questions. And I would just randomly ask, um, just, and every day we asked this for weeks. It was great until we really understood this. We knew this backwards and forwards, and it was cool. It was really cool. It was the greatest thing when these kids graduated and went home. I don't know what they're going to do with this info that they got here, but they are prepared to change the world. So it was pretty awesome. It was pretty great. Let me just spend a couple more minutes on this. Let's look at the must know number 2 again. What creates each of these things? So number 3, on soil health principles, these are the things that we do. So what I would, we would talk about the must know number 2, what creates each of these, I would often be looking for them to go to number 3 on the soil health principles of what they're going to do from that list, but not necessarily. Sometimes I would get some brilliant answers from these guys as we would have long discussions. We would come up with thoughts and ideas on, a way to increase incatreids and earthworms and microarthropods in our soils. um, it's easy to just say, well, don't till the soil and they will increase. Those are the simple answers, but it was super fun when we would be out there working in the garden, just hoeing the rows of corn or hilling up the potatoes, or whatever we were doing that day. And we would start having discussions about it, because it was just so great to be out there in the soil, and we would see new things every day as we were working in the dirt, and we were putting mulch down on the ground, and we were looking at different plants, and we would start thinking, this part of the greenhouse we watered a lot, and the other part of the greenhouse we haven't been watering as much. Does that mean that the water cycle is not working in the part of the greenhouse that's requiring more water? And so we'd get shovels and we'd start digging around, and we could even take soil samples in here, to the microscope sitting right here by me, and we could look at it, and we could see the differences in the soils. We didn't do a lot of microscope work this year with my students. The week we were doing microscope stuff, they actually went home for a family reunion, and then they got sick, and so they were actually gone for 2 weeks during our course. I did ask them if they wanted me to make extra time and go through the microscope, but we didn't do a lot of that because they never really envisioned themselves running a lab or anything. But anyway, I think I digress a little bit. So, but this is a good slide. This is an important slide. I think everything on this slide, I should look at it real close before I make the statement, but I think everything on this slide has certainly been verified by many, many of the great leaders in regenerative agriculture today. Elaine Ingham teaches almost all of this. David Johnson teaches all of this. Gabe Brown, the whole his group, the Understanding Ag group, focuses on this. The Alan Savory people focus on this. I haven't heard the Alan Savory group go into a lot of these details, as detailed as this slide, but there's nothing that I have found them teach that contradicts with any of it. So we have some of the greatest scientists alive today, and this is their information. I did put this together. This is my list. I don't know if all of them have everything on this list, but I certainly don't think that any of them would disagree with this. And if they did, I certainly want to have that conversation. So if you're watching this on our YouTube recording, Let's have that conversation. Put it in the comments and let's talk about it. Um, because I want to learn. I want the truth. I'm not about being right. I'm about learning the truth. So I want to be corrected if there's anything I ever say that's a little bit crazy. So I'm going to open this up to Q&A. So you can go ahead, and those of you who are on live, go ahead and just unmute yourself and you can ask me a question, or you can type it into the chat and I will read your question. So if you have any questions about your own garden, or anything about that we talked about tonight, or anything about climate change or world events, anything you want to talk about, go ahead and ask me the questions, and we will discuss it right now. I am excited about this time of year though, because it's fall and it's a great time to gather up lots of compost materials.
So how do I prepare my garden, winterize my garden? Can I use that term?
Yeah, sure. Winterize is not a bad term at all, John. Yeah, so how do you winterize your garden? Well, when you just got to remember, you want to be growing as many plants as you can, even throughout the winter. I understand you're in northern Utah and you can expect to have snow on the ground. That's good. That's fine. It's a good idea to be growing some kind of a cover crop on that soil so that there's living roots in that soil, because there are species of microbes that are going to be alive during the winter time that need those living roots in the soil. So you want to be growing something. It's not too late to plant garlic. You could plant a bunch of garlic. The problem is if you planted your entire square footage to garlic, then you'd have garlic everywhere when it's time to plant your early spring things. So you don't necessarily want to plant it everywhere. You do need to understand your context of what you're growing and what crop you're going to grow after your winter crop. If you're not going to grow anything, you want to cover that soil with thick layer, like 2, 3, 4, 5 inches of any kind of an organic material, like leaves, wood chips, shredded bark, that kind of stuff. You want to get it on there. Straw and hay. If you are putting something light and fluffy that has a lot of air resistance, you need to be careful that the wind doesn't blow it away. So if you gather up a whole bunch of leaves and just put them out there on your garden and they're all fluffy, the wind's going to blow them away. But if you could run them through a shredder and put them out there, and then get the sprinkler going and sprinkle water on them so that they're matted down. And once you get them matted down good, that should keep the wind from blowing it away. So you may want to water it once a week with a sprinkler, half an inch of water once a week for the next 4 or 5 weeks once you get it on there. So the best thing to do is living plants in the soil. But if you're planning on planting a garden early in the spring and you don't want a bunch of living plants already there because they'll act like a weed at that point, then the next best thing to do is to cover it with a mulch that can start to decompose. So that's how you winterize your garden. What you don't want to do is till up your garden and have it sit there all winter with bare soil. Because if you do that, it's going to freeze. The frost will penetrate deep into that soil. That will knock out a lot of your beneficial microbes. So you need to keep it covered. You need to keep a blanket on it. You need to think of yourself. You're going to spend the winter as one of these 8 important organisms on this slide. So you're going to go out there and you're going to get under that soil surface, 3 inches under there, with the incatrades and the nematodes and the earthworms. And will you be comfortable? That's the question you've got to ask yourself. Will I be comfortable? Will I be cold? Will I be miserable? Will I freeze to death? And if the answer is yes, then you better get more mulch on that garden. Now, obviously, I'm using a little bit of artistic license here in that because humans are not these other creatures. But you do need to keep the soil you need to keep a good blanket on it.
So what's going to happen this weekend is that my irrigation will be turned off.
Okay.
And I've got plants that are still growing, and they'll grow, I guess, until it really freezes.
Good. Yeah, that's good.
Should I use house water to water, or just?
You probably don't need a lot of water unless you're putting on a whole bunch of thick leaves or straw that's going to blow away. The only reason you're watering at this time of year is to wet down anything that would blow away. Because at this time of year, you're not going to have evaporation coming out of the ground. Your plants won't die.
Okay.
So, like if you planted a bunch of garlic and peas and kale and cabbage to grow over the winter, maybe spinach or lettuce, you probably don't need to water it because there'll be some rains here later this fall, early winter. There'll be some snow. On warm days, it'll start to melt a little bit. Those plants are going to be fine as far as water goes. So the only reason I was saying to water is to wet down any kind of a mulch that would blow away.
Okay.
All right.
Another question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm getting political. So
yeah.
are we going to have a food shortage this winter?
I have no idea. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you. I'm not going to have one. And I wish there were more than a few people on this call because then they wouldn't have one either. But yeah, I don't know. It's hard to know what current events are going to do. Do I think there's going to be a famine in our future? I think there's a high probability of that. We could have a famine. The way the world is running right now, it's crazy. It's insane, you know. I don't know. I mean, are we going to be in a war with Russia and China? There's there's a chance of that too. Who knows?
Yeah, I guess all those things are possible. We just hope for the best.
Yeah, that's what we have to do. We need to stay positive, hope for the best. I'm certainly not a doomsday person. I don't do this because I'm a prepper. I don't do this because I'm a doomsdayer. I do this because it's my passion. It's my first love. It's just so fantastic to me. It's awesome. You know, so many of my farming friends have gone out of business. I have personal friends who have committed suicide because they couldn't pay their bills on their farms because the farm took everything out of them. It took their will to live out of them, which is awful and horrible. But the thing is, they could have had, if they would have known this information, they could be wealthy people. But they didn't know this information. The only information they had was the information that is given out by the government agencies. You know, the USDA, you go down to your government office, and I'm not saying anything bad about the people who work for these agencies. It's just that for so many decades, they haven't been teaching them how to do the right things so that we were working with nature. It's all been against nature. And when you fight against nature, we have to come up with man-made stuff to fight it. But when we work with nature, it just kind of starts growing on its own, and we don't have to buy all those expensive things. And without the expensive stuff, we're selling our crops for the same amount of money, but we're making a profit instead of going in the hole. And farming gets fun again. And the food tastes better, and it's more nutritious.
So you have a greenhouse. I don't. How do you preserve the food that you've or do you need to preserve your food over the winter?
Yeah, so we have quite a bit of food that's bottled and canned and dehydrated. We have a big root cellar that we put stuff in. We do have the the greenhouse for sure. So we have a lot of fresh foods that we're able to eat throughout the year. People don't need to have a greenhouse. Greenhouses are great. They're wonderful. They're awesome. They're a really good benefit, but people have been growing food for thousands of years without a greenhouse. So you don't have to have a greenhouse, but when it comes to preservation, drying is a really great thing to do. I raised a whole bunch of dried beans this year, and as I've been sitting here taking classes and listening to webinars during the days, I just sit here and I shell those beans by hand. It's a crazy thing to do because it's time consuming, but it's very therapeutic.
So are they dry? Your bean
Yeah.
shell or
Yeah,
okay.
they're dried beans. So what I do is I just grow them out in the field, and then I just pull up the plants once they're completely dead. No green left on them. They're completely dead and dry. And I just push them down into bushel baskets. And then I bring them in here, and then I'll just pull up a bean pod and crack it open. You just kind of smash it with your fingers, and then I just get the beans out. So
That's a good idea. I think I have some that I could do that with.
I mean, it's therapeutic. I think if there were some people, I don't even know what those sciences are, but where you study the brain, you put the probes on the brain, and you listen to, and then the computer scan what's happening. Like if you're having stress, or if you're feeling peaceful or whatever, it's healthy. I'm telling you, it is healthy to do farm work. It's not healthy if you're stressed out, because a lot of times people get super stressed out doing farm work because they know that they're working because they have to, and they're going to lose money on it, and so that really freaks people out. But when it can be a you know what is the word, like a beneficial thing, a therapeutic
Right.
exercise. Kind of like doctors who tell people to go take walks in nature. So you're too stressed at the office, you've got to uh, take an hour 3 times a week and go on hikes in nature. I mean, there's doctors who prescribe that to people to help their anxiety. But that's what it is for me. And I don't think I live a pretty nice life. I don't have a lot of anxiety, but I do find that when I'm listening to a seminar or an audiobook or something, if I'm working with my hands, shelling beans, because you don't have to think about that, I actually retain the information better. And I'm not saying that all people do, but I do. So, it might help somebody else.
So how do you say you have a root cellar? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's just a hole in the ground that you can walk in. It has stone walls around it with a roof on top, steel roof on top, and then it's buried with about 2 feet of dirt on the top. And then there's just a normal door, and just framed a door into it. And it's probably um, 8 to 10 feet wide, and maybe 10, 15 feet long, something like that. But yeah, so we can fill that full of potatoes and carrots and beets and onions and garlic. Anything that stores without being too dry, we put it in there. And you want some humidity in there, so we usually have a bucket of water sitting in there, so there's some humidity. Uh, but yeah, it just sits there. It's just an old time root cellar like people have had for hundreds and hundreds of years.
So do you use sand or anything?
Sorry, John, I couldn't hear you.
I'm sorry, do you use sand,
Oh
for
yeah.
example?
Oh yeah, you certainly can. Yeah, if you had some tubs like 5-gallon buckets or bigger tubs, you could put sand in the like wet sand. You could put the uh like anything that was growing in the soil, you could put in the wet sand. Some people get confused about onions. Onions are not a root; they're a bulb at the bottom of the stem, so they grow above the ground. So you wouldn't want to put onions in the sand. But if you put carrots, beets, uh, and potatoes in sand, then they don't dehydrate at all. They keep their moisture levels up so they don't wilt. You know how when you have a bag of potatoes and they're sitting in the cupboard for a little bit too long, they start getting wilty in
Yeah.
your kitchen? Well, if they're packed in wet sand, they don't do that. They're just as crisp as if you dug them up right out of the garden. So that's an excellent way to do that.
And what about onions then?
Yeah, onions, I would put those just on like a board, so they're on sitting on shelves. They can be in sacks, but I normally don't like to store them in sacks because they don't have enough airflow. The onions in the center of the sack, sometimes they have too much moisture and they'll begin to deteriorate and you'll get a rotten onion.
So
When you
you
go
just
buy onions, you'll buy a sack of onions, but that's just a way to move them around. It's not the best way to store it. So I like to just store them like one onion thick on shelves.
okay. And in the root cellar or in the
Yeah,
house? Or?
yeah, in the root cellar. It's good for them to be around 50 degrees. The normal temperature of the ground underground is somewhere in the 50s in most places. So that's a good storage temperature. If you can store things a little colder, it's probably better. But if you wanted to build a walk-in cooler or something and keep it at 38 degrees, that's probably optimal. It's like a refrigerator. But for most people for their garden, you wouldn't necessarily want to do that. If you're running a little farm though, you have to have a walk-in cooler. That is a necessity. Otherwise, when you're harvesting stuff, it all wilts down and is not saleable by the time you
Mhm.
get it to your customer.
So have you sold any of your food in a market or wherever?
I have neighbors who come and buy stuff from us, but
Okay.
we don't sell a lot. Our purpose is not to sell a lot, though. I mean, not that we're against selling it. Our whole idea is just we're more focused on feeding our own family and getting really good at soil health, and then we teach soil health. That's our main business. It's not so much selling the food, but we could sell more food. If we wanted to drive our food over to the Wasatch Front, in northern Utah, because it's only a 3 hour drive from where we live here in Nevada, just on I-80. So if we drove over there, we could probably sell all the food we could grow. We would just have to find the people and the markets, and just like running any business, you just have to go out and find the customers. But that's just not something we have pursued because we're focused more on the education and the scientific research of creating the most functional soils ever. Because there's a lot that we don't know yet. There's a lot that people don't know about how to create the best soils. So we're doing a lot of experiments, trying new things all the time.
So, well, one thing that I just comes to mind. Okay, so you say your sand is wet.
Yeah.
Uh, is it? Do you add water to it, or does it stay wet
Yeah. So
normally?
if you go out there every week, I do like to stick my hand in the top of the barrels to feel the sand, and it should feel like a wet sand, like just like if your kids were playing in a sandbox. If it's wet enough to make a sand castle, that's just right.
Okay.
So you don't want it soggy. You don't want a lot of water in there, but you don't want it super dry either. So yes, if it starts to dehydrate and dry out because it's evaporating, just take a few cups of water and just dump them on top of there to keep it moist. But sand holds water pretty good in an underground situation like that. So if you start with wet sand, it usually stays wet for, I don't know. I think last year I added some water maybe twice through the whole winter in some tubs of carrots I had.
Oh, and your tubs, the same way with your cut carrots, the same way with your potatoes then.
Yeah, yeah. If it dries out, you want to keep them moist.
Hey. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, does anybody else have any questions tonight? All right, John, good questions. I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up. And we will be back next week. And next week, I will share the major things that we talk about in our 17-week class on the second month. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And if you need to get a hold of me, you can go to my website at www.georgicrevolution.com, and my contact info is there. Okay, good night, and thank you for participating.
Thank you.